Thought we'd start first with a prayer. So if you'd like to rise and join hands with one another. Holy Spirit, we join with earth and with each other to bring new life to the land, to restore the waters, to refresh the air. We join with earth and with each other to renew the forests, to care for plants, to protect living beings. We join with earth and with each other to celebrate the seas, to rejoice in the sunlight, to sing the song of the stars. We join with earth and with each other to recreate our human community, to promote justice and peace, to remember our children. We join with earth and with each other. We join together with diverse expressions of our one loving hope for the healing of earth and its atmosphere and the renewal of all life. Amen.
Amen.
Welcome to Interfaith Action for Justice Conference organized by Faith and Action Montana. We believe that the time is now for people of faith to join and add our moral voice to address the climate crisis, especially as it impacts vulnerable communities. By coming here today, you honor your spiritual connection to earth. Thank you for coming. Hopefully this conference will be a valuable time for all of us to learn from each other, to grow in community, and to gather strength to advocate for climate justice in our lives, in our faith communities, throughout Montana, and in the world. This morning, we'll first hear from eco-theologian Frederick Krueger address the ethics and theology of climate change. After our hosted lunch, Ben Long from Resource Media will teach practical communication and advocacy skills to help us address climate change. In our second workshop, we will begin building an interfaith movement for climate justice in Montana. And this is what I'm really excited about. Finally, we'll close with a locally sourced and locally catered meal and interfaith celebration. And I'm hoping you'll all join us because the menu looks great. This conference would not be possible without the support from many, especially from Emmaus Campus Ministry, Wilderness Society, Sierra Club, Annunciation Church, Thrive-In Financial Grant, and our gracious hosts, the University Congregational Church of Missoula. We also thank MCAT, or Missoula Community Access Television, which has graciously provided their recording services today. Thank you to our experts who will be leading us today, Frederick Krueger, Ben Long, and Ann Carlson. Our meals today would not be possible without the generous donations from many sustainable farmers and gardeners. Timeless Seeds, Missoula Grain and Vegetable, Sweet Root Farms, Lifeline Dairy, Tucker Farm, Great Harvest, Anna's Bakery, River Song Gourmet Catering, and the Good Food Store. Finally, thanks to all of the individual donors and volunteers who made this event possible. Let us open up with a more detailed introduction for Frederick Krueger.
Good morning. I'm Father Rob Spaliatzos from the Orthodox Church here in town, and I am really excited to introduce Fred. Our community has had the opportunity over the last day and a half to be learning already with Fred, and as I share a little bit about his experience, I hope it gets you excited about his talk this morning. Frederick Krueger serves as the executive coordinator for the National Religious Coalition on Creation Care. The NRCCC sponsors the National Prayer Breakfast for Creation Care during the coalition's annual Washington Week program. This gathering brings religious leaders to Capitol Hill and administration offices to present the formal environmental declarations of religious institutions to government officials. It sponsors dialogues with government leaders, hosts conferences on a variety of topics, and addresses current religious and ecological issues. It has articulated an interfaith ethic of God's creation as the earth of God's and all that is in it. Thou shalt not destroy the earth nor despoil the life thereon. This simple ethic summarizes the biblical mandates on care of creation and allows people of faith to address any ecological issue and provide a critique of whether an action is right or wrong before God. Kruger also serves as the executive director for the Orthodox Fellowship of the Transfiguration, an Eastern Orthodox Christian organization which promotes concern for the environment and the importance of building an explicitly Christian way of life. He also serves as chairman of the board of directors of World Stewardship Institute in Santa Rosa, California. The WSI provides a nonprofit umbrella for 10 ecological ministries that together provide a panorama of religious concern for forests and tropical reforestation, oceans, climate change, wilderness, endangered species, appropriate building design, nature as a book of wisdom, the importance of ending mountaintop removal as a method of coal extraction, and the Christian Caring for Creation Prayer Network, which is a national prayer ministry for environmental issues. A major new program that is now emerging is the Interfaith Oceans Ministry. All of these ministries had their beginning out in wilderness with the concept of nature as a book of primal wisdom. This led to the founding of the Opening the Book of Nature program. This ancient concept originated in early Judaism and was a major theme in early Christian monastic life. With the rise of science and technology, this practice faded from parish life. Late in the 1970s, Kruger began to recover a method of extracting the wisdom inherent in the design of wild nature. This gradually led to many recognitions of the value of wilderness for spiritual experience and a traditional theology that was at once edifying, transforming, and inspiring of a stream of programs and projects. This allowed for a modern connection to the ancient desert fathers and mothers. In the early decades of Christian monasticism, fathers and mothers went into the wilderness not because they disliked the people or the cities, but because they sought a stronger and more transforming experience of Jesus Christ and the heavenly realities. The Opening of Book of Nature program showed that those ancient experiences are still available in the present if wild nature is approached with a right, respectful attitude and a vision of Christ and the Holy Spirit everywhere present and filling all things. A consequence of this effort was the establishment of the North American Conference on Christianity and Ecology in 1984, America's first large membership organization dealing with Christianity and ecology. Before his work in religion and ecology, Frederick Kruger served as a Serbian linguist and a Russian intelligence analyst for the National Security Agency, as a political campaign manager and a fundraiser for the Republican National Committee, as an IBM technician, as a heterodox priest, and as a magazine editor. He has also served as a trout fishing and wilderness guide. He is the author of over a dozen books and was selected by the HarperCollins publishers from among America's Bible scholars to develop the texts used in the Green Bible, published in 2008. He attends St. Seraphim of Sarov Orthodox Parish and OCA Parish in Santa Rosa, California. Frederick was at a conference in Cranbrook, Canada about 2 years ago, and one of our parishioners had the opportunity to meet and interact with Frederick, and he came back and he said, "We have to bring Frederick Kruger to Missoula." It took a little time, but we're excited to officially welcome him, thanks to the Interfaith group, Faith and Climate Montana. So thank you to John Lund and Abby Huseth and all of those who participated in helping to plan the conference. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Frederick Kruger to you all this morning. Thank you. You want a little table for your water? Can I find something?
No, I'll put it on
Okay.
the floor.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning. Well, thank you for that introduction. What a beautiful city you have. I've been impressed by the tree-lined neighborhoods, by the spaciousness of your campus, and by the little bit of your heritage that I already understand. Just in shaking hands with a few people, right away I can feel that there's a vigor and a vitality here in Montana that we don't quite have in California. For my talk today, I'm going to ramble. We're going to kind of go cross country. The way I thought to begin is that let's look at how Christianity was taught over 1,000 years ago when people couldn't read. It begins with a vision. And then we'll bring it up into the modern era and have a more systematic approach to our foundational shared perceptions through the scriptures. But then let's peek at the science, because science are the eyes of society, and they tell us how the world works. Whereas religion, it functions more as the heart, more as that seat where we discern right and wrong and moral propriety. And then we'll conclude, and this is I just added in last night after talking to Judith Holloway last night. We had a little movie. And I'm going to tour through all of the different major faces of religion in society and see what they already say about climate change, because we're all already united in seeing that it's an important mandate for this day. And then we'll look at a few guidances on what to do, because the important thing when we hear about the disasters on the horizon, there is a pathway through it. There was a great conference that Pope Francis put together probably about 3 years ago on what is the state of the planet. He brought together the world's top scientists, economists, sociologists, and he heard from each one. This was all preparatory to this great encyclical called Laudato Si', which is not so much for Catholics as it is for the whole world. And it encompasses everyone. And so in preparation, there's this gathering. And Pope Francis, he asks, are all these the signs of the end, or do we have a path forward? And there was discussion amongst, probably a third of these people were Nobel laureates, and others were preeminent in their field. And after reflection, they said, yes, we can survive, but only if we are very intentional, very deliberate about making the course corrections that are essential so that we will remove these toxics and poisonous substances for the future of the planet. And more specifically, we're talking about the consequence of rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, of methane, all the different greenhouse gases. Some are more potent than others. And the important thing to remember is religion, representing the vast majority of the human population, are all agreed that this is the issue for our generation. This is the time when we must now make a major course correction in the direction of civilization. We know this in the same way as if you were to go to a physician and the doctor says you got high blood pressure. It's not by guess and by golly, because these things are measured. And so there is a direction to the patient. Get your blood pressure down. And in the same way, the scientists, using the same essential science as medical technology, is assessing the pulse of the planet. And they are saying, get your CO2 level down. And so there is a way to do that. But it begins by reevaluating the whole structure of society, because we organize society around energy. Yes? You can see it in transportation, in heating, in the way that we electrify, in the way that we have our food system. All the systems of society are involved. But already, new ideas are starting to pop up. How many of you have heard of the new concept of earthship housing? It's a form of biotexture. The main examples are originating in New Mexico, outside of Taos. And these are homes that supply all their own energy, that gather their own water, that have greenhouses, but they are self-sufficient and off the grid, and they have no carbon footprint. And in these greenhouses, high in the Rocky Mountains at Taos, which is about 7,000 feet in elevation, they can grow bananas. And so you can see this on the internet at earthship.org or earthship.com. If you want to buy one, it's at earthship.com, and they got plans for a variety of different things, but they're finding that people who live in these, they no longer have to pay electrical bill and water bill and garbage collection bill because everything they use is organic and recyclable. In other words, there are solutions. And the solutions are opportunities to reorganize society around ways, well, like in the opening prayer, that are more just, that have peace with our neighbors, and that care for future generations. So the prayer hit it right on target. Now, in working with the National Religious Coalition on Creation Care, we have found something that is really essential in working across the sweep of religion. And it's a simple protocol. We don't have the same theological frameworks, but we see our religion as our map of the cosmos, how energy moves. And in this protocol, we ask you, each person, to fulfill the fullness of the requirements of your outfit, of your church, your denomination. No compromises. Reach up to the highest and bring that to the table, but respect the responsibility of every other person to do the same. And then where we meet is on a common focus on caring for the earth, on avoiding all negativity and criticism. Oh, I'm sorry, your hair isn't parted the right way. We don't do that kind of thing. Instead, there's this relentless art form to draw the best and the highest out of each other. We can do that. And as a consequence of this protocol now for 20 years, we can say, we haven't had a single disagreement because these issues are not that difficult. And it's easy to arrive at consensus. And so the task then is to mobilize religion to ground itself, to do the common prayer that Christians share, which is, Thy will be done on earth. How? So that means you have to have a reflection on what that means. But that becomes a common guiding theme. Yes? You can see all of a sudden, oh yes, that's what we're supposed to do, but what has intercepted our ability to ground our religious aspirations don't come from religion. They come from the consumerism, the individualism, from the materialism, from these economic and social pressures to conform to the assumptions of corporate culture. Increasingly, that's what we have. And so we have a challenge just to fulfill all of the implications of each of our faith traditions. But across the whole spectrum now, we can say that Catholics and Jews, that evangelicals and Buddhists, that mainline Protestants and Hindus and Native Americans, we all see that the challenge of our time is to cooperate in this great movement to bring the moral and the ethical and the spiritual strength of religion to the spectrum of issues that are associated with climate change. Because climate change doesn't stand by itself. You know, we have an addiction to fossil fuels. We find it hard to step away almost in the same way as narcotics. We're addicted to fossil fuels. And so if you go into a group like Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the first things that they ask, you know what it is? I'm an addict. And so I'll take the step and say, I am addicted to fossil fuels. Because I came here by a plane and it used fossil fuels. We did walk, and so that was one step good. But at the airport, I was picked up in a vehicle that was driven by fossil fuels, and so I'm part of the problem. But when you know that you're part of the problem, then you can see that the direction that you have to go is less and less and less of that to which we are addicted. Because we have a choice between addiction, asceticism, or a self-determined apocalypse of our own making. Because we're responsible for our actions. You drive through a red light and you get pulled over and you get a ticket. And you're responsible. You violated the law. We got cosmic laws. Yes? You violate those and there's a penalty. And so we are already inheriting the penalty of too much fossil fuels by the stronger storms that are hitting the world. We saw it in Houston, 60 inches of rain in one storm. That's 5 feet. You know, many kids can't even stand 5 feet. Then that was followed by Maria, the strongest storm, wind velocities higher than we've ever seen. That swept Puerto Rico. It still hasn't recovered. So that's one. And where I live in Santa Rosa, we had a whole series of record-breaking incidents. We had record rain in the 2016-2017 season. We broke all records by a lot because higher levels of CO2, they mean more capability of holding moisture in the atmosphere, so more rain, but in a redistributed pattern from historical norms. And so, coupled with record heat in September, we dried out to tinder dryness, this record growth of new bushes and shrubs and all that, it all became tinder because we had gone from May all the way to September without a drop of rain. Made everything very dry. Plus the heightened temperatures, because, you know, each year, it's hard to face sometimes, and we'd rather go to sleep than listen to it, but 2014 set an all-time record for average temperature around the world. But that was beaten in 2015 by a new level of record, and that record was beaten again in 2016 with the average temperature measured from all the measuring stations around the world, again beating the previous temperature. This is the trend. So we see, and so what happened in Santa Rosa, high winds like we had never experienced before, coupled with the tinder dry conditions, we had a firestorm. 7,000 homes were incinerated. Many businesses and buildings, the big Kmart made out of just concrete and steel, crumbled to the ground under that torch-like horizontal moving fire. A lot of people lost their lives. But the scientists told us this is an early indicator of the kind of things that climate change will bring to society, to bring to civilization. Half the town had to evacuate. That most of the people didn't know where to go, but they couldn't stay in the city. So some of them went hundreds of miles to stay with family, and so this was an up-close experience of the new kinds of storms. And then we've had some other new things. We've got a new kind of weather coming into California. We have these atmospheric rivers, which have a strange shape. It's like a long finger coming up out of the tropics, and it will have 100 times more moisture in it than carried by the Missouri-Mississippi river system. And down it all comes in a tiny little area. And on the East Coast, they begin to see, you may have seen this in the news, a quality called a bomb cyclone. This is a winter hurricane, and it's characterized by a shear in atmospheric pressures. I don't understand the meteorological details of it, but we see the effects. So this is the new world that we have created, that we're moving into. And so what I want to do from my notes, begin to approach this in the way that Christianity was taught, and most of religion before the printing press. And so most people heard things orally. That's why storytellers were so important. And there was an art to doing that. And everyone, except perhaps the religious people, they didn't read. So they just listened. And a lot of our institutions are still shaped by that legacy. For instance, they would read the books, and that would be called an audit. And an audit comes from the Latin meaning to hear. Audere, more correctly. And we still call it an audit, but there isn't a hearing of the book so much as a reading, because now we've become literate. And so you see there's all these kinds of things that shape the way we do things that are legacies of the past. So in the early days of religion, we began with a vision, not with a premise. And the vision would be that God fills all things. So we saw that in the scriptures. Paul would say that in him we live and move and have our being, and that is everywhere present and fills all things. Some of the prayers still convey that from the traditional religions that go back at least 1,000 years. But one of the challenges, even when we had this vision, the vision would be like the challenge of teaching fish the nature of water. Hard thing to do because they live in it all the time. And yet, this is how we understood deity. That we live in it, and are of it, and by it, and for it, and to it. And it is everywhere present and filling all things. In the modern era, mostly under the influence of, what would we call it? Under the force of science and technology, there's a tendency to say God's up in heaven. Well, dimensionally, you could say that's true, and that we're down here. But the premise was always an interconnectedness so that you could find a tight correlation between Native American assumptions and early Christian ways of teaching close to the land. But the challenge has always been to fulfill these deep theologies, because theology is kind of like the ocean. You can step into it and be very comfortable in the waves, and it's only that deep in the waves, but sometimes it rises up and you back off. But the ocean is deeper than you think when you're just there on the shore. In fact, it's so deep, and in many ways, it's still less understood and explored than the surface of the moon. But that's like our theology. Our theology has great depth. And the challenge is to find those keys of transformation. You know that in history, every major successful movement includes religion. And without religion, great things have never happened. We see in Gandhi, he had a unique formula because India, dominated at that time by Hindu and Muslims, and to a lesser extent by Buddhism, but it also included some spicing in of Zoroastrians and Jews and Christians. Christians about 1 or 2% of India. And so how was he going to bring all that together? Because he had been very successful in South Africa. Do you know that he's the father of the apartheid movement? And it was getting very dangerous for him because the apartheid government wasn't happy with Mohandas Gandhi. He was an attorney. And he decided to go back to traditional dress just to emphasize that he was the voice of the people and the poor. And he developed a formula. He studied, because when he came from South Africa and he'd been very successful, they said, "Oh, we want you to join our Congress Party. We are going to fight the British." But Gandhi, he says, well, let's slow down and study this. And he takes a whole year and he tours India, he studies the problem, and he concludes that the British were not the problem of Indian colonial status, but the Indian people themselves were. And so a solution had to be found in the heart of the Indian people. And he said, well, we've been doing a lot of things that have allowed us to be subjected to the British. Look at how we treat the Harijans, the untouchables. That's not right. And look at how we're dependent now for cloth on Manchester textile mills in England. He said, we can do that ourselves. We don't need to buy salt. We can make salt. And so he developed what he called the social agenda. And he said that there is a formula that every movement must have. And he took it from his study of Christianity. He said, look at how Christianity spread from what seemed to be just a few people early on, but they had three key things. They had a messenger, they had models, and they had missionaries that would spread it out. And he said, that's what we need here in India if we are going to be victorious. But that model must penetrate deep into the Indian's unique predicament. I'm setting this up as an example and a model. And I never even planned to do it, but this is where we're going. And so first there was an examination of how India was culpable for its captivity to the British. Yes? And so he lists all these different things, and he calls that the social agenda. And then to address it, he sets up the model. And it's the community that will embody all of those solutions. And then he goes to religion and says, we must have a commitment to God in which we make a pledge and a commitment to change our lives and to take that social agenda out to the world, to all the provinces of India, and tell them, because communication has to be part of the solution. Just like for you and me, part of the solution is communicating at this stage the urgency of addressing climate change. Yes, there's a lot of people who don't understand it, and it's often a generational issue. The younger you are, the more you are aware of it, and the more you are in favor of action to turning this around. But once a person reaches about 40, and in this group of people from 39 down, we have, according to the demographic analysis, about 87% of the population in favor of vigorous action. But when we get to the age group 40 to 50, we see about a 10% drop. And we see another 10% drop at the next decade of age drop until we get to those 60 and older, where over half say, well, I don't see it. Or, it's not going to affect me. Or, who cares? And so, it's important particularly to tell your parents, hey, guess what I learned? Climate change is real. And we can see that because here's something I did at the beginning of this week. I'm sorry this is so small, but I printed out the latest measurements from Mauna Loa, where we have the assessment of CO2, and it's at 411 parts per million, way above anything in the last million years. The highest it went in the past million years was touching about 300 parts per million. Now, can you imagine if you had a blood pressure and it was in the 200s, and doctors say when it gets that high, you're in danger, and you're reading 310. Right away, you know some remedial action is necessary. And so what Gandhi did, understanding the similarity of the problem, is he identified key commitments that he wanted all people to take. And for the Indian subcontinent, he identified some traditional values and some that he created. He created the idea of satyagraha. And satyagraha means truth-seeking and grabbing onto it and embracing it. And so that was the first quality he wanted people. Discern what the truth of our situation involves. And then second, he said brahmacharya. And that was a traditional condition. And what it meant is, I don't need this and I don't need that. In fact, I used to be a fundraiser. I used to help rich people give away some of their money for political causes. And you know, I saw something that surprised me. That some of the wealthiest people in America were also some of the most miserable. And that it did not necessarily make people happy, but it did make them protective. It did keep them kind of tight and careful to protect it, because there's a principle. As much as you own something, it owns you. And so as much as you have stuff, you got to take care of stuff. And the more stuff you have, guess what follows? More commitments and less freedom. And so religion has often encouraged people who are going to go deep into religion to have a vow of poverty. And in that poverty, there's a certain releasing of all the commitments and attachments and obligations to do other stuff that intercepts and inhibits that vertical journey. You know, if you look at the cross for Christians, there's more to the vertical side usually than the horizontal. That means there's more potential and more opportunity for the vertical than the horizontal, meaning material. So he had three commitments that people made. Satyagraha, brahmacharya, and the last one was ahimsa. And that was do no harm. Do no harm. Especially in your dialogue with people, be good. You know, there's a principle in diplomacy. Because you need to be a diplomat to approach the conditions in which some people fortify themselves. So the first step in diplomacy, you have to respect the other person. You connect to them. And you try to draw them out. You don't say, Achtung, this is what I believe, and this is what you shall believe as well. That's not an effective approach. Instead, you dialogue. What do you think about this issue? Why do you think about it? Draw people out rather than impose how you want to go about something. And that's the beginning of the training of a diplomat. Because in diplomacy, you find the right approach. It may come from this direction, it might come from over here, you don't know. But each person in each situation is unique, and you want to kind of get a feeling. How am I going to do this? How am I going to be effective afterwards? And so here religion have some insights. For instance, what we learned in meetings with members of Congress is if you just go in with your message, you're done in 5 minutes. But if you prepare, you study, but you also bless them. You ask a blessing. And then when you're done, you do the same thing again, so that the message, in a sense, as the words are seeds, the prayers and the blessings afterwards are the watering and the keeping in mind these kinds of conditions, so that there is a continuation and a recognition that the way that people think isn't just one way, and it's not just material, it's not just the words, but the way that you speak is the conveyor of ideas and energy. And so if you want penetration, you reinforce it. And there are different ways to reinforce. You can send a thank you letter, a letter of appreciation, but there are spiritual ways that apply as well. And you know I'm not even following any of my notes here. But it just is in the flow of things, because that's what you do in diplomacy. You might have a plan, but if all of a sudden in the time and the place it's going in a different way, that's how you go. And the test is, does it work? It's very simple. You want to be able to be transformative of the individual to whom you are speaking, and to show that it's right. And so the model of medicine is a very effective one, because the sciences are the same. We know that there's been this steady rise of carbon dioxide. Mostly it begins about the end of World War II. The economy starts to expand, we start to emphasize industry. This is the steady rise of CO2 in the atmosphere. At the time that our grandparents were born, we were about 280 parts per million in the atmosphere. And then it began to grow at about 1.7 parts per million. You can see it's a steady rise. And now it's growing at a rate of about 2.1 parts per million per year. And that has to be slowed down. And it requires cooperation from government. So I had the opportunity to go to the UN conference in Paris 2+ years ago. And it was a gathering of the leaders from around the world. And the presidency of it was from France. And they announced that this is a great historic gathering. Never before have so many world leaders come together to address a crisis which is global. And so after the French president's speech, up came President Barack Obama from the US. And he said, we're in. We see the problem, the science is clear, and we have no alternative but to reduce our CO2. Then comes China, President Xi. And he's all on board too. They need to be on board because the dust storms are starting to blow sandstorms into Beijing. The air is so thick you can bottle it and look at it, wow. And I know that standing right here and seeing the building across the road, you can't take a clear picture of it because the air is so thick. So I've been there. And it is no joke. They lead the world in cancer incidents and in heart disease. And they know they have to change because it's going to affect leaders equally to poor people. And they see this kind of data that shows, this is 300 years almost. It was very small growth in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. But suddenly, it's going up. And this is why it's called a hockey stick. It's called a hockey stick because it's going along flat and all of a sudden, whoop, up it goes. And that's what it looks like. And to put that in its historical context, here is almost 500,000 years of world. And we know what the CO2 levels are because we can measure it from ice cores. And the ice we can date, and by dating it, we can be very precise in being able to say what the CO2 levels were. And you can see that during an interglacial period, the CO2 level came to about 280 parts per million, just what it would have been at the time when Missoula was being pioneered with Lewis and Clark coming through, and then the fur trappers and so forth, about 280, but occasionally it would drop down to around 180, and that would precipitate an ice age. So there's a flow, almost like a cycle between 180 and 280. 180, real low, ice age. There's a melting, and you can see it's almost rhythmic. Now, something else that's equally significant, I didn't mean to knock that over, I was close, it didn't. Here is the correlation then between CO2, rise and fall, and the lag time with temperature. So CO2 takes the lead and other greenhouse gases, and then some decade or 2 or 3 behind, the temperature accommodates, correlates, and it's a tight pattern. Up and one goes up, the other follows. It's like a dog on a leash. And so we know with CO2 going up the way it is, what's going to follow. This is not rocket science. This is something pretty simple. And at the same time, as the CO2 is going up, this is about a dozen years, and it's tracking the ice in the Arctic. And it shows a downhill slide. The ice is melting, and it's not by guess and by golly, it's by measurement. The ice level at the Arctic is dropping. Temperatures in Alaska are going up faster than anywhere else in the U.S. And the Arctic shapes our climate. So we had an anomaly this past year in that it was above freezing at the North Pole for several days in a row. It was warmer where Santa Claus lives than here in Missoula. And we had other unusual patterns emerging just like that. And so as they measure warming above the norm, the whole planet is starting to show above average warmth. Wherever there's red, it's above. Wherever it's blue, it's below. There's one little spot where it's blue, right below Greenland, where the ice is all melting and it's keeping very cold water in place. This is by measurement. It's not by guess and by golly. It's not philosophy. Remember, science is the eyes of society, whereas the moral interpretation comes from religion. Same thing is happening on the world's oceans. Sea surface temperatures are the hottest on record. Never had it so hot as it is today. And the oceans shape our climate and our weather. And they trigger the storms. The warmer the ocean, that's where hurricanes and typhoons and cyclones get their energy, from the differential between the normal temperature and the heightened temperature, and we got temperatures as high as we can reach now. And as a consequence, we have the coral reefs dying like the movie showed last night. That's a combination both. About a third of the CO2 goes into the ocean. It's metabolized there, and it's changed by the seawater into carbonic acid. So the ocean is about 30% more acidic now, and that's inhibiting the shell formation of shellfish, of plankton. Plankton's down at the bottom of the food chain. You shrink the bottom of the food chain, and guess what happens? There's a ripple. And so the coral reefs are being bleached by the combination of acidity and heat. This is not by guess and by golly. This is by measurement of the acidity in the ocean. And that's the result of our driving and our heating and our air conditioning and the way we use electricity. And so it's telling us changes are in store, or we are disasters of our own making. And so this one takes a little bit of looking at. But the Arctic is experiencing freakishly warm temperatures that surprise the scientists, because the science, in fact, because it was by consensus, it had to aggregate all the different scientific perceptions. It was actually more conservative than what the leading scientists wanted to emphasize. And I'm sorry I'm offending people who want to walk out, but it's still the science. And I'll leave this here so that you can look at it, because it is a thermal picture of the shape of our world. Now, churches are lining up to address this. And what I'd like to do is tour a little bit through every major religious outfit in America, and sort of approaching it in alphabetical order, but I'll get to everybody if I can find the right page to start. This is a book on religion and climate change, and it aggregates together the formal statements of religion. It shows pictures, how the world is changing. Storms are growing more powerful. Tropical diseases are spreading. The forests are dying. The wildfires are increasing. The death rate is rising from heat waves. Species are becoming extinct. Climate refugees will increase. This is a picture of how the world right now is already experiencing climate change. And it's based on human experience last year. And so this is only accelerating. One of the interesting things for commercial purposes is there's now a sea lane that has opened up over Asia. You can now take a ship from Korea or Tokyo and go up over Russia, over Siberia, and come down to the ports of Europe. They save 8, 9, 10 days. And so they like that. So that's, there's some minor little facets of information that are not harmful in the short term. So this is, in the second part, are all the religious declarations on climate change. And we'll begin with the American Baptists. Baptists are probably they're a very populous church. And the American Baptists, I'm just going to take 2 or 3 lines out of each of the statements. And they say that learning about the causes of climate change is important for your self-education. That one solution of many, building and renewing our homes and church facilities to be energy efficient. That's pretty easy. As much as you can, use public transportation. Become ecologically aware. Advocate for the passage of legislation to reduce carbon dioxide output. There should be mandatory higher fuel efficiency. We should combat deforestation. This is what the American Baptists say in their formal statement that they'll take to government. The Church of the Brethren. This is like the first cousins to the Mennonites and the Amish. And they have a statement, and they say, climate change is an issue of justice. That a major challenge facing humanity is an equitable standard of living. So they're concerned that climate change is impacting the poor. That the people who were least responsible for climate change are now experiencing the brunt of the impacts. This goes on for 3 pages. The Catholic Church. Pope Benedict, this is probably 8, 9, 10 years ago, he emphasizes, how can we remain indifferent before the problems associated with climate change? Can we disregard the growing phenomenon of environmental refugees who are forced by the degradation of their natural habitat to forsake it? And as Catholic bishops, the U.S. Catholic Bishops' statement says we seek to offer a religious and moral perspective. And just to conclude, they say that delays in addressing climate change will only compound the problem, make it more intense, and make future remedies more difficult, more painful, and more costly. In other words, we better start working today, if not yesterday. Here comes the General Board of Church and Society for the Methodist Church. Methodist Church have about 60,000 congregations across the country. They say, and their statement goes on for 4 pages, so you're just going to get a tiny little peek into it. The transition to energy efficiency, renewable energy sources, will combat global warming, it will protect human health, it will create new jobs, it will ensure a secure, affordable energy future. They did that statement in 2004, and we have to call on all the major emitters of fossil fuels to take responsibility for their actions and to work to reduce the carbon emissions. Now, here is a statement that's been a surprise to some, because the evangelical Christians, and they have an evangelical call to action. It's sort of a minority statement. Evangelicals are organized in a decentralized way, so there's no overriding authority. So each congregation has to be approached individually because of the structure. And yet, the concluding statement from church leaders says, we now have seen enough to offer the following argument related to human-induced climate change, that it's real, that the impacts on society will be significant, that our moral convictions as Christians demand a response, and the need is urgent. Here comes the Presbyterian Church. They say we have to shift the subsidies and financial incentives towards industries specializing in renewable energy and energy efficiency. That we have to increase the percentage of our energy supply to come from wind and solar. We have to remove the market barriers for the producers of these clean sources of energy. And on they go. National Council of Churches, they say, Earth's climate is warming to dangerous levels. That caring for the creation must undergird all dimensions of church activities. The Episcopal Church, One of the most dangerous and daunting challenges we face is climate change. And privileged Christians need to move from a culture of consumerism to a culture of conservation and sharing. The Lutheran Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, climate change is the most pressing issues facing all of God's creation. I mean, this is one after another after another. It's like right after Pearl Harbor. Should we have a response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor? And the response was overwhelmingly unanimous. My dad volunteered on December 8th, and my uncles did too. And so the Lutherans say this is one of the most pressing issues facing our world. And the great paradox, this is echoing what we just heard from the Presbyterians, those least responsible will be the most severely affected and least able to adapt to changing conditions. So they also add that while the United States is only about 5% of the global population, we consume about 30% of the world's resources. Here comes the Orthodox bishops of America. They say we must learn all that we can about climate change. We must set an example in the way that we live, informing others about this threat. We must discuss this with parishioners and with all of our friends and family. We must raise the issue before public officials, and each of us can do something. And they conclude saying, every generation has some challenge, and this is the challenge of our present generation. This is the challenge of our generation. Each generation has something. Here comes a minority statement from the Southern Baptists. The Southern Baptists have this minority statement. And moral doctrines of the Christian church, they demand stewardship, that it's time for individuals, churches, communities, and even government to act. The African American churches, that's the AME Methodist, it's a variety of denominations, and they say, we pledge to address climate change in the social justice tradition of the African American church. One of the last active ministers who worked with Martin Luther King is the Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley from Atlanta. And he sees this as an extension of civil rights because he says the black people are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, as was seen in Katrina in New Orleans and most recently in Harvey in Houston. Houston flooded terribly because they had no, I got to tell you a joke. When Governor Perry from Texas came to California, he came and he emphasized, there went my water on the floor, business is booming, you should come. And 2 weeks later, there was an explosion in Waco, Texas because of lack of regulations, and Governor Brown, he said, yes indeed, government is booming in Texas, and we have the regulations that would allow that sort of thing not to happen. So that was for the dialogues between California and Texas, that was made it all on the cartoon pages. So the United Church of Christ, very strong on climate change. And they say the effects of global warming are already clearly observed in a statement from 2007. But the United Church of Christ urges U.S. government to respond to global warming with great urgency, with firm leadership, by supporting mandatory measures that reduce the absolute amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And it calls on all church ministries to address the severe nature of this global warming crisis as one of the most urgent threats to humankind. You know what this is when we listen to all this? This is like in the time of Noah, when there was the admonition to prepare because it's going to get wet. And it's going to get wetter than you think. And so Noah built a boat. Well, that was a condition in which the failure to respond resulted in precisely what Noah said would happen. This is repeating. We see the measurements, we see the statements from religious leaders, and now you get to convey and carry on that message to those that you know. And in the process, you'll understand it better. And then we need to pray. What do we do? At first you don't know. But as we listen to the guidance, because one of the interesting things in each of these statements, they begin to give us direction on how we can steer through this crisis. It's a unique thing. It's a global, it's a planetary crisis. So the Central Conference of American Rabbis, they have a statement. And it says, strong action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is consistent with a number of long-standing public policy positions, including improving air quality, increasing mass transit, development of non-polluting alternative energy sources, energy efficiency. And so they call on the Congress, they urge the federal government, they urge us all to respond. Now, there are different branches of Judaism. And the conservative rabbinical assembly, they too have their statement. And they conclude, we support all legislative efforts at the local, state, national, international levels that allow a shift from high carbon to low carbon and clean sources, and we will examine our own investment portfolio with the aim of enhancing our socially responsibility investments to support businesses and communities, but they ask all of us to start to make changes. Now the Buddhists are on board as well. We live in a time of great crisis, they say. The ecological consequences of our own collective karma. That's how they shape it. Individually, we must adapt behaviors that increase ecological awareness and reduce our carbon footprint. We have to drive fuel-efficient cars, reduce meat consumption in favor of environmentally friendly plant-based diets. The Hindus have a statement. They all gathered around the world in Australia, which you might not guess, 2009 statement. We must be the change we need to see in the world. Native Americans came together in Anchorage, Alaska. This is the declaration from the indigenous peoples. Mother Earth is no longer in a period of climate change, but moving into climate crisis. We insist on an immediate end to the destruction and the desecration of the elements essential for life. We call for a phase-out of fossil fuel development and a moratorium on new fossil fuel development on or near indigenous lands and territories and around the whole world. On and on they go. Mother Earth is no longer in climate change, but climate crisis. From the Muslims, a startling change is coming upon us suddenly, drastically, unpredictably. The dire consequences of climate change and global warming have been caused by human activity. Muslims, who constitute 1/5 of the world's population, can make a big difference if only they take these warnings seriously and heed the teachings of our faith. That Allah calls for these changes, and they quote from the Quran. But Christians are about 1/3 of the world's population. Catholics alone amount to 1.4 billion. And so there's a need to join up with one another, cooperate, that there is greater strength through cooperation and coalition than individually. But individually, you must still do something. The World Council of Churches, they put out a lot of statements, but urgently we call the churches to strengthen their moral, stand in relation to global warming and climate change? On and on it starts to go, and then we move into a station of leaders. And the leaders begin to say things like, Pope Francis, we have to take good care of creation because people can forgive, but nature does not forgive. If we don't take care of the environment, there's no way of getting around it, he said. We'll pay for our destruction. And then we list all these different Roman Catholic initiatives. There's a Protestant reflection. I'm looking for a couple of key things. Rabbi Warren Stone, he's the co-chair of our National Religious Coalition. He says that climate change is wreaking destruction on our fragile, sacred earth, and it's become the most profound religious issue of our time. Bold initiatives are needed. Patriarch Bartholomew, speaking for the Eastern churches, global climate change represents an unprecedented threat to life on earth. We have already denounced ecological abuse as sin against God. We should recognize that it's also a crime against humanity. A crime against humanity. There's a few more. Gus Speth, he's actually very vigorous Lutheran who saw on the video last night. Here's one, though, from the Catholic Church. They are declaring that climate change is now the Church's #1 pro-life issue. Here in the National Catholic Reporter, reported a few years ago. So if you want to think of yourself as pro-life, climate change is the issue. So it goes on and on like this. And so what are we going to do? Why don't we just pause a little bit and get some questions if you have any? If not, the reason, did you have a question? Okay.
It was very interesting to hear you.
I can't hear you.
It was very interesting to hear you say that the Catholic Church said climate change is our #1 pro-life issue.
That comes from the National Catholic Reporter reporting on a conference of clergy.
And I just wanted to make the point that population growth contributes to the increase in carbon emissions.
That's right.
And therefore, stabilization of the human population and ultimately probably reducing the human population humanely over generations in smaller
Thank you.
families has to be a part of addressing climate change.
Thank you.
You know, I've always believed that you can tell where people or organizations or whatever's priorities are by where they put their money. And I look at our federal government and I see priorities in weapons and in a number of other things other than climate change. In fact, I hear very little discussion from the powers to be about this. You know, I hear it from individuals like you. So I go, so what are we talking about here?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It takes training, though, to be able to come to that kind of a perception. And so education is needed, and so is a broader awareness of the panorama of concerns. And so if we look at climate change as a threat multiplier, which is the term the military uses, then we have to be concerned about refugees. We have to be concerned about sea level rise. We have to be concerned about how to accommodate and handle that. We have to look at the reduction in the wheat crop, which means that there will be food shortages. There is a new proposal called silvopasturing for people who raise cattle, ought to plant trees right there in the pasture. It will be a healthier soil. There's so many things like that that are important that could be included, but we got to start with the core, and then like a series of concentric circles, we ripple out and begin to engage all those issues, because what both of you are commenting on are very important things. Thank you. So, the approach that historically religion would have seen is that just as the trees, they supposedly clap their hands, that there is a sort of cosmic worship, a cosmic liturgy. And that when you see climate change as much more than an issue of environmental preservation, as a moral and spiritual problem, then we begin to look at the ethics that religion had historically. And once a vision was set of the presence of God in all things, what then followed was a sense of respect for all things, so that Fyodor Dostoevsky, who said both beauty will save the world, but he also said that you have to love it all. That as you love even the animals, and the more that you love the whole earth, then the mysteries of creation begin to open up to you. And there are insights that go along with the action of loving, which is a form of service. So that in the technical language of theology, we call this a Eucharistic ethic. And that Eucharistic ethic, it was giving thanks for all things. And the more you give thanks, there's inspiration that flows, because thanks is like a note on a musical scale, and the octave above it is praise. And that the more you open up into that, there's an energy and a blessing and a vigor and a vitality that begins to emerge. And along with that, there was what was called a liturgical ethic. And that liturgical is people working together, working cooperatively, working in unison with their thanksgiving, so that they challenged the false notion of individualism. You ain't there just by your lonesome. But there is the need for cooperation, and that led to an ascetic ethic, that you don't need this. And so you take the three together, the ascetic ethic, you don't need as much as you think, the liturgical ethic, which means you work together cooperatively, and the Eucharistic ethic, that you give thanks for everything, you value everything. All of a sudden, if you take the first letters of each thing, you find that Jesus gives something more than changing water into wine, because take the first letters from each of that, the ascetic, the liturgical, and the Eucharistic, and what do you get? A-L-E, or ale. So you get a little firmer kind of drink than wine. Now, that's a trite little thing. So what I want to look for here are some guidelines for how we can go forward. And one of the first things that's important is that we have to change the way that we live, because the way that we have been living has given rise to all these problems, yes? So instead of depending solely on government, we must each become accountable to our faith traditions and to begin to live out the solutions. Become an example. Besides, how can you expect government to do anything if you're unwilling to do it yourself? So, we're called to pray. Help. That's the essential prayer. Help! And find ways to change ourselves more than changing others. Because now you're responsible. You're in the driver's seat of this. Can you imagine what the whole world would be like if everybody was like you? Imagine you are replicated across the face of the earth. Could the earth survive? How many planets would it take if 7.3 billion people lived like you? Could it be done on this earth, or do you need a couple more to plant and mine and explore? That's something for you to think about. If the whole world was like you, could it be done, or would we collapse? So, that's the first thing. Pray to see yourself. Pray to change your personal attitudes and habits, because a form of metanoia or repentance is fundamental. We got to change. We ain't been doing enough. And the proof of it is we got these problems, and who's responsible? Every single one of us. Number two, we have to live in a manner that's consistent with what we believe and how we pray. It was back in Egypt when Clement of Alexandria said that there has to be a lifestyle that goes along with being a Christian. It wasn't enough to just say hallelujah and I believe, but it had to line up. And he began by discussing food and drink, the utensils that you use, the way of the kitchen, the way of the living room. Everything was involved. And so it demands a reduction and elimination of our consumption of fossil fuels. The sooner the better. But it also requires a pursuit and acceptance of alternative energies, the solar and the wind. I put solar on my house 10 years ago, and you know what? It's very nice not to pay electrical bills. Besides, they're going up. And so it's a different payback in different states depending upon and California was paying for half of it. And so that doesn't hurt. I don't know what the rule is in Montana. We must continually learn all that we can about the emerging implications of climate change. Study doesn't hurt. The more you know about the situation, the stronger is your situation. You're better prepared to address what you understand. And so we must set an example in the way that we choose to live, always admitting, yeah, I'm part of the problem. Just like in Alcoholics Anonymous, they began to now, yeah, I guess I got that addiction. I love to drink. Or whatever it is. Narcotics Anonymous, they have to admit, I'm an addict. I'm an addict to energy. You know, we often don't like the word sin, and we repulse sometimes from the idea, ooh, you're an addict. I'm backing up. I don't want to be near an addict. But that's what we've become to energy. It takes a while to let the implications of that sink in. We're energy addicts. We didn't know it. We kind of started in a way that seemed innocent. And at the beginning it was, because that's what society was offering to us. But now we know. And because we know, we're responsible. It's that kind of simple stuff. So I'm going to close with each generation faces these tests that challenge the life of the world and the integrity of our civilization. That's what's at stake now. We're looking at the integrity of our civilization and how is it going to go forward. I mean, the great civilizations of history all go through this, and they either adapt as Rome did between the time of Republic and morphing into the empire. But then the empire became rigid, and with all the assaults of barbarians, it fell. There is a study by the Department of Agriculture that was commissioned by President Roosevelt in 1936. It was the Dust Bowl era. And they selected Dr. William Loudermilk to conduct a study of all the great civilizations of Earth, and he identified the 15 major civilizations. And he found something very unusual, and he announced it on the radio from Jerusalem in 1938. He found that 13 out of 15 major historical civilizations collapsed because they abused the land or its environment. And they did not fall because of warfare. They did not fall because of foreign aggression. It didn't fall because people didn't like them. It fell for internal reasons. But it's easy to point out an enemy that's outside. It distracts us from our internal difficulties. Oh, that's true. That's intentional deception. I worked for the National Security Agency. I saw our government lie to Congress, and Congress voted 438 to 4 to start bombing north of what was called the DMZ in Vietnam. We didn't tell the truth. We didn't tell the truth about there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, even though our own military had gone in and said, nah, they ain't there, which was a great disappointment to some people. And so what I want to say is act because you know that religion is different. It has no financial stake in its examination. It has the welfare of people at stake. And it's concerned about doing right by God, because if it's right by God, then by God it's right. And that's where we are right now. Any comments or questions? Yes, way back.
I like the list that you gave about action, but I think one of the big things, so I'm a pastor in the Lutheran tradition, a tradition that really emphasizes grace. And so I think that, and I know your own tradition, from the Eastern Orthodox tradition too, also says a lot about grace, God of grace. And I think that that's one of the things that we also need to rely on, that our religious traditions can give us. Because, you know, I can't afford an electric car right now. I just had a new baby, and babies are super expensive. I would love to have an electric car, but I can't, you know, and that you have to fall back on your tradition to say that is okay for you. You need to do the best that you absolutely can, yes, but you also need to have grace in order for you not to fall apart, because it's too easy for us to see the world on our shoulders, and if we do that, I think we're going to fail.
That's very good, because we're told to come boldly to the throne of grace in time of need after we have done all that we can, and so that grace is an added bit. But if we rely on that and we fail to be responsible for the things that are in front of us, then we can't expect all the grace that we want. But that's true.
It's a both and. Luther loves that.
So, yes.
You mentioned about the protocol that was on the reading the book of nature. Can you talk just a few minutes, or is there something to read?
Well, the early church said that you can learn the same thing from nature that you can from the Bible. Yes, Origen would say that questions that you ask of Scripture and the questions that you ask of nature, they will both come to the same conclusion. And why is that? Because they both come from the same source. And so they're bound to come to the same conclusion. But there is a whole method. Now, Luther talks eloquently about how God writes the gospel, not only in the Bible, but in the flowers and the trees and the hills. And that's because he's part of the earlier tradition, because he's right just after the time of the invention of the printing press. The printing press is what really distinguishes earlier attempts at a Reformation from Luther. Luther's got the advantage in that he can publicize and promote and promulgate and crank it out. Yes?
I think that institutional religion needs to acknowledge that they are part of the addiction.
I think we heard that.
Well, and buildings, beautiful, huge buildings, and money spent by churches on things that add to capitalism.
Yes. You know, this is a journey. And that is already in planning, but we're slower to respond than we would like. And while that's very true and very pertinent, push. We need your push. Yes.
Thank you for talking about what churches, the statements.
It's all in this. A couple of years old now, but Religion and Global Climate Change. It's a handbook for faith leaders and climate activists. And it tours through the... No, I didn't write it. I stole it. I edited it. That's a difference. You don't write, you just take and you chop it up a little bit like salami and only serve a little bit for the sandwich. Yes?
Last night I mentioned an initiative that petitions are being circulated here in Montana to put I-184 on the ballot. And one of the things it allows is churches to put a larger amount of solar energy on their roof, and when they have extra energy, to share that with the poor.
Yes.
And that is in this initiative, along with more wind and solar. It's an extremely comprehensive, and I'd really like to have you look at it.
Oh, that'd be very nice. You know, you mentioned something that's really important, and that's to give this conference legs. You need legs to run. You need legs to go places, and the best way to give a conference legs is to develop a statement and circulate it so that you have a tool that summarizes your insights and that you can take it out hither and yon, but give it to certain Montana people who would like to hear it, like Mr. Zinke and the governor and your legislators and your mayor, and give them the voice of religion unified on this issue. It doesn't take much to do that. You can whip it out in an hour. Yes? I can't hear you.
Yeah, have you ever read any of Ayn Rand's?
Well, in Fountainhead and in her assumptions, because I know her, and the message that she has, it's a very interesting one because she's a product of the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and she was furious that the government confiscated her family's pharmacy, and so she committed to finding the exact opposite of communism, which was a secular individualism. And so, yes, I do know.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you probe into her philosophy, it's very anti-environmental.
That's right, it is.
It's very anti, and in addition, it is the major textbook or the Bible for the current capitalist movement.
That's right.
And so if you understand what she's talking about, you can understand what points you can address. Because what she did was she provided a vision for the current administration and the current form of capitalism. She provided that vision, and they were able to sell that vision to the public. Like, for instance, that it's better to have technology, or it's better to be a consumer, or we're no longer citizens, we're not consumers, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The corporations are now citizens, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the problems that I found in the environmentalist movement, being an environmentalist for, 55 years, is that there is no real cohesive vision like that for the environmentalist movement. In other words, we don't have the vision of what it would actually look like, what our civilization could actually achieve, or our interrelationships with each other, with our plants, with our animals, with our food sources. We don't have that. We've got it in little tiny places. We've got it in pockets. But it's really difficult to market the vision. Actually, marketing has never been easier right now because we've got the internet. We can reach millions of people with a short video. But right now, we don't have a cohesive vision of what our civilization could look like with an environmental agenda.
And that's true. And that's because there's no heart to the environmental movement except the residual and subconscious sense that derives out of religion, that we have to respect the land. And so, but religion does have that, and that's why the environmental movement needs religion, because religion does have a cohesive vision, and it's a really simple, that everywhere is the presence of God, and we have to respect that. And so conservatives, if they're true to that philosophy, must help conserve the integrity of the land, the integrity of creation. But what is missing in the environmental movement for many faith people is people. And that it's everything that's outside us accepting us. And so that's what causes a certain flaw in the environmental movement. And yet, if we look at the religious statements, it's actually stronger than the Sierra Club. But it's not as focused because it's broad focus, including the Creator, our neighbors, and the creation. And so it's interesting that in going to the Sierra Club headquarters and touring with the officers and studying their demographics, about half of all their members are vigorous people in religious congregations. Not just background. And the person who received the greatest number of votes in the recent Sierra Club vote is a vigorous religious person who supports an end to commercial logging on national forests, for instance. And he's bringing the religious insight into the Sierra Club. And the former president, Carl Pope, he came once to this great conference in Santa Barbara that Patriarch Bartholomew came to, and the Catholic cardinals and a variety of other people. And he made an admission and an apology to religion for forgetting that religion had the ancient traditional respect for the environment, which the churches should say, well, we didn't emphasize our concern for the earth because we have overwhelmed with so many other concerns. But it's very interesting to read the Sierra Club's apology to religion for forgetting that it was the source of a lot of the intuitions of the environmental movement. That's just a side remark, but it's part of the history of the last 2 decades. And so, yes, I'm agreeing with you. And if we look at people like the Koch brothers, they're champion libertarians, which is the philosophy of Ayn Rand, which is get for yourself while the getting's good and to hell with everybody else. And the Mercers and many of the corporations like that, because by nature, the corporations have no heart. They have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders to turn a profit. And so that becomes their mandate, and it becomes something into which good people can enter, but they have to subsume their values into the values of the corporation, and the corporation only values the bottom line. And the consequence is they're like robots. They're financial robots that emphasize turning a profit. And if someone is hurt or if the land is damaged, it may benefit the bottom line. And because that's their concern, they can't be counted on to help very much in this challenge that we face. In fact, the lineup is becoming science and religion, and corporations on the other side. Corporations are the ones that are misleading us about the seriousness of fossil fuels and carbon in the atmosphere, that are fighting us in Congress, that are now bigger than many nations. One corporation by itself can have a larger total income than half the world's countries. That's the terror of our time, one of them. Yes, way back.
People like the Mercers and the Koch brothers and all these other folks that you've been talking about, the corporation people, oftentimes they refer to themselves as Christians. And I know there's a term that I've heard, and I think it's pretty, it says what it is, that they're prosperity Christians. And they cherry pick the Bible to the point where they say that, you know, if you're rich, then you are doing God's work. If you're not rich, then something's wrong, and to hell with you, basically. And so how do we as people of faith combat that twist that they've done, and they've been so successful?
Well, we know that the author of our faith was not rich. He was not King Midas. It was not King Midas who invented the church, but someone who had only his coat. And that is an innovation in the same way as the Ku Klux Klan claims something in a twisted way of Christianity. That doesn't make it Christian. And so the scriptures give us a clue. And they say, by their works you shall know them. Not by what they call themselves, because many people can say this and they can say that, but by their fruits.
And that's what they claim. They're rich, and so therefore they've fruited, and so therefore they're right. And you know, it's a conflict for me, because it's given to me, it's given Christianity a bad name amongst people who don't understand.
Well, Christianity is a journey, and everyone starts on the outside, because in the scriptures we're all created in the image of God, but we're supposed to work toward the likeness of God. And so everyone is at a different place on that journey from potentiality to actuality. And just by saying that you're there might mean you're in the great global expanse of the world, and you're starting, but you're nowheres into fulfilling what the guidelines, the scriptures, the criteria provide and tell us to fulfill.
Yeah, however, I mean, look at these mega churches, these huge mega churches that are just overflowing with people, you know, all over the place. And they often are proposing this prosperity Christianity aspect. That, you know, the whole purpose of tithing is to get back a bunch. You know, if you tithe, then you're going to receive all this stuff back, and it's monetary, and it's materialistic. So I don't know how to talk to people like that, to see that, to somehow get through to them that I have a different point of view.
Yeah, your actions are going to speak louder than your words. You don't need to worry about what's wrong, but you got to focus on doing what's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think it is in California. I think my experience is similar, but in Montana, and I work with a lot of younger people who have just completely given up on Christianity because of those perceptions. And so we're in this odd time when that moral heart voice is so necessary and so important, and there's a huge disconnect between the people that might be most energized and excited and poised to go, but they're just disconnected from that primary voice because of the perception of who Christians are. You know, so I mean, most of our churches that are Catholic or mainline and others are not loaded with the millennials and younger, as we all know, for these very reasons, because they feel like we've lost our way. And I think those churches that you're talking about are providing, you know, just nice, clean, in-a-box answers in a chaotic world, and that feels good. And I don't
Sure,
want to...
pile them in. There you know, thousands of people there. Praise the Lord and all that, you know.
You know, Abraham Lincoln had a comment about this kind of a situation, because he was approached by a lobbyist. And the lobbyist asks a question. He's going somewhere. And he says that if you call a tail a leg, how many legs does a dog have? And Lincoln says, why it still only has 4 legs, because calling it a leg doesn't make it a leg, and so calling it a Christian doesn't make it a Christian. That you've got to cut through all the false commentary to lead and justify something that's extraneous, but it's still what it is, and it was, and will be. Yes. Oh, yes, she's close. Oh, this is Vancouver. I met her 30 years ago.
And you don't look any older. To the question of the woman back here, I have an answer, but then I have another question to which I don't have an answer that I'd like to bring up. I would like to say to a person who's turned off by a Koch brother who says he's a Christian, are you really going to let the Koch brother tell you what Christianity is?
That's good.
But here's my question. How in the world do you get through to people whose minds have been seared by the anger of the talk show hosts? And they're spitting what they've heard on the radio. They're not thinking for themselves. They don't think they should have to think for themselves. And they are angry with you. They're angry with me if we raise a point or a question that might erode or tend to undermine the way they think, have been taught to think, have accepted the talk show hosts' mantras and dictums.
Yeah. It's the same as it was 2,000 years ago. There was great anger at anything that disturbed the Roman gods and or the Greek gods. And you had to stay centered on what was right and true. And there may be animosities. Too bad. Those are still in a certain way things that are not right. But you have to hold to what is right. And you have to let your light shine as much as it can, because that in itself is a teaching, and you can't stop people from going in which direction they want to go. They have their own prerogative, and if they're angry, they have to live with that, because there's a price to anger, and it is a quality where you get tense, you get mad, and you know how much joy there is in that? There ain't any. And so they get to live in that stew that's self-created, and that's not your fault. You can be peaceful and smile and tell them that ain't right. But what else you don't need to even do that. Because you're not responsible for those people who are angry, who are upset, who didn't understand, who stumbled and fell. You can lend a hand to help them, but they created that fix, and they're often the ones who are the champion consumers and energy users. And so it's very interesting, the scriptures, because if we look at the book of Revelation, gosh, when you read chapters 4, 5, and 6, it is describing all these problems that are being poured down on the earth by the dark angels. And it all happens in the earth and the land and the water, the air and the animals. And then suddenly something happens that people never understood. And they couldn't understand, because the good angel shows up, and it's got what's called the seal of the living God in its forehead, whatever that is, we don't know. And it says, and listen, it says, hurt not the earth, neither the seas nor the trees. Now what's he say that for? And people could never comprehend, how can you hurt the earth? What's this talking about? Should we keep this in the Bible or throw it out? They kept it. And now all of a sudden, we're at a time when we can understand that comment that counters all the plagues that are coming down. But then it goes on, and you can read this yourself. So that passage I just quoted is Revelation 7:3. But if you come to chapter 11, down at verse 18. Oh, it's the time of the judgment. It's the end. Whenever and however that is. And it says, oh, why, those that, even the little people who respected and feared the word of God, they go in. So you get a song that comes from that. Oh, when those saints go marching in. And it even says they go in. But those that destroy the earth, God will destroy. Now, we don't need to get into the judgment, but it's just something to keep in mind that that's how the scriptures conclude. So that if you reflect then with the earlier statement in Matthew, where as you do to the least of these my brethren, you do unto me, that's what it says. That's King James Version. So how did you treat your neighbor? So the conclusion is there's a mercy there. Because if you failed with your neighbor, all right, you get a second chance. There's a grace there, like our pastor friend says. What did you do to the land? And so those that destroy the land, well, gosh, that's 2 strikes. Maybe there's a third, we don't know. But that's how the scriptures conclude that. And so one way to understand that is, oh, it must be a mercy. But there it is. Yes? I'm stirring the pot a little bit more than I expected to do.
I just wanted to join the conversation of what you were saying. So I've been working on climate change issues in Montana and a lot of rural communities for almost a decade now. And so part of my job is to really engage with people no matter where they are in terms of, are they angry, or do they believe in it, do they not believe in it, and have those kinds of conversations. But I feel like the first step when I'm confronted with someone who's very angry is to respond with compassion and to ask why. Because often what I see is someone who's in pain and who's having a really difficult life or a period of their life. And so for me, it's trying to have empathy and ask some questions so I can have a better understanding of what's driving that. And perhaps they feel like they're not being seen or heard either, which I think is something that's very common perhaps across the country today, which has led to a lot of the polarization that we're seeing. But I was really struck, Fred, by what you were saying yesterday at lunch about, as a diplomat, how important it is to start not where you are in a conversation, but where the other person is. And I was wondering if you could say something about that, because I feel like this is something that the church, in which faith leaders and community members are really excel at, is compassion and learning and empathy.
Well, it's really simple. This is international affairs diplomacy 101. It's respect people. And if you want to communicate something, find out where they are and don't begin with where you are. Because if you start with where you are, you're often talking to the wall. Because if you got a lot of education on something and you start up and there's no prerequisites to understand that, to communicate, it's going to miss. And so you want to connect. And to connect with people, you look in the eye and you say, how are you? How you feeling today? What do you think about this? And so that's how you deal with a congregation that may not be dealing with climate change because, well, it's political, it's controversial. And besides, maybe the science isn't settled. I don't know. I haven't studied it. I don't know it. And if I start getting into that, it's deeper water than I'm willing to wade. And I can only go into the shallows. I'm not prepared to go into the deep water. So you respect people. You focus on them. You find out where they are. And then in that dialogue that emerges that is spontaneous and genuine and real, more than this is what I want to tell you, I got an agenda for you, that almost always misses. But what will connect is where you are, and then build on that insight that you already have. And so you're the person who's with the Wilderness Society, yes? And so if we want to connect to legislators and change wilderness policy, we look at what legislators need. And so, for instance, I worked in West Virginia, and a lot of legislators say, I vote my faith. And so what we did is we would go and develop a statement, and we did on the Monongahela National Forest. We did a spiritual statement that's pretty simple about the values of that land, and then we ran it around the mulberry bush of all the different religious groups, got them all to sign on, and then as a united voice from religion, we approached the 2 senators from West Virginia, and we approached the congressmen, and oh, the churches are all for it, we're all for it. And that's a formula to build new wilderness lands wherever you are, because legislators, they believe that religious voices are a majority, particularly if they're Republicans, and that's the way you get them, backing up and saying, yeah, I believe that we should be doing that. That's a good idea. I've been for it all along. And you bring them on board. And so that's how we have the Monongahela Wilderness Area in West Virginia. And we could do it anywhere. There's a formula there. There's a method. There is a process that you could follow. And Bill Meadows loved it. I don't know about the present guy. I don't know who he is. Yes. Oh.
Yeah, I'll defer to the person on that page.
I feel like I've learned so much today about things in the Bible that I didn't know about, and about how to approach people and hear from them. So knowing that you want to perfect your message, I'd like to comment on one thing that I felt a little negative about.
Oh, good. Tell me. Thank you.
And that was the statement that humans forgive, but nature doesn't.
That's from the Pope. That's not me. I was just reading from somebody else.
I thought maybe you were quoting somebody, so I suppose that's who I need to tell.
Yeah, that's who you got to deal with. You're not dealing with me. I'm just the reader.
As ecosystem scientists, I feel that nature is very forgiving.
Yeah, it recovers.
Healing itself, when we damage it and so on, but just like any of us here, if it's to the point where it can't heal itself anymore, it's not that it's coming back for vengeance against us, it's just, collapsing and we collapse.
Yes, that's probably right. That's probably right. But he was trying to teach people a lesson. And so we've got to reach down in there and say, why was he saying that? And particularly, who was he saying that to? And what was he trying to achieve? And I can't answer all those questions, but he does reach a lot of people. Yes.
We're pushing on 12 o'clock.
Okay, I'm
We'll
sorry.
have to have a break. I just want to add one comment, and I think one of the critiques of mainline Protestantism and perhaps Catholicism that I hear is that we rely so much on grace, and in my lifetime this kind of idea of just pure grace and kind of just kind of automatic fullness of God's grace, which comes with this no matter what piece to it, but there is a way that almost lets us off the hook. And and this is what I hear from the younger folks. It's like, okay, so God loves us and forgives us, but we're destroying our planet. That doesn't help us. And we haven't shifted that, we haven't pivoted our message, even though at the top, all of our judiciaries are going to say, this is the most important thing. It hasn't trickled down into the, we have a few clergy that are bold enough to go, but into the kind of ethos and culture of most of our congregations yet, which is part of our job. I mean, I think we've let that slide on us, and it's a lot easier to tell everybody God loves you and, be good and go home than it is to come in with this harder critique and
That's right on.
And push to change. I mean, then I even have to change. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it takes time to galvanize. If we use World War II as a model, we had the intentionality on December 8th to move forward, but it took years to build up, and in an even slower way, because there's an inertia to people's value structures. It takes time to communicate, which is why one of the first challenges is to talk about this with your neighbors and everyone else on the street. Even in the grocery line, you get some new people there that you haven't talked to before. Yes, and then over here.
This is brief. This is why the position or the embracing or not embracing of science is so critical within the church.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fred and I chatted, and I'll let you respond to the question, but I just want to share that Fred and I chatted about why there is, if I have a letter from the ecumenical patriarch, it makes me feel comfortable about talking about this in sermons and addressing it with the community, because I know this is the message that's coming from the patriarchate. And why, in spite of the fact that we have this collection of letters and statements and positions from churches across the country and the world, why there's still resistance of pastors to talk about this and to bring attention, because we have the statements of our churches to be able to say, hey, I'm just sharing what our church is saying on a national level. What I would encourage, and I think that this is important for us to find these statements on our own online and whatnot, is for us to know what our national church is saying, and then to ask our pastors, can we talk about this? Can you bring this up? And to encourage our pastors to know that these are statements that are already there, and you're just sharing the message to our local people. And I think that, one of the things that I've learned about young people and the church, I think I'm still kind of young, is that they expect the church to be a place of change. And if it's not, they're not going to keep coming. And so if our churches can be a place where our pastors and the communities are agents of change and are interested in moving in directions that are difficult, our young people will continue to want to be connected. But again, our young people need to be able to also say, why aren't we talking about this? Because the national church is talking about it, and I have a collection of letters that I've just been encountering, and again, I think that's really an opportunity for our congregations to remind our leaders, myself included, that this is important and we should be talking about it. And it might make some of us uncomfortable, and that's the thing that Fred and I talked about, is that we have donors. Maybe we're going to upset a donor, maybe they're not going to give money to the church, and maybe that's going to make it hard, maybe the pastor loses his job. But integrity is the thing that Fred and I were talking about, and being a person of integrity perhaps is what we are hoping for from our pastors.
Maybe I should save some of my thoughts for later, but it seems like your comments at the beginning, tying wilderness to God's vision, that might be a place that we could think about our churches capitalizing on, to use a bad word, bringing our sermon to a natural spot and asking for guidance from nature and God at the same time as we seek out a vision for going a different direction. That, I don't know, that's just an idea.
I just want to piggyback. Are you a minister?
No.
Okay, but I love what she's envisioning. And yesterday when we were in a park with Fred, and he was having us go into the wilderness and listen and come back and share what we heard and see, he passed out at least one or two handouts. They're simple, they're just 2 pages each, and I wondered if the church would be gracious enough to let us use their copy machine to give to people like yourself, or those who are priests and ministers in this room, or leaders in different capacities. And it's so beautiful. It's writings of the Desert Fathers and other prophet types. But it is so, they're succinct in communicating God and nature in a way that's very poetic and beautiful. So I hope that you can leave with a copy today, and people who want can just look at those. It's
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I forget the copy during.
Oh, you're a dear. Do you happen to have, where's Fred, his originals? It's so lovely. It will just feed your heart.
Well, everybody has access because there is a huge store of religious writing, Christian writing, about how important it is to embellish our faith with the lessons of wilderness. I mean, St. John Chrysostom would say nature is our best teacher, and he was considered the golden voice of the early church. And St. Jerome, who was the first historian of Christianity, and he said that the desert fathers and mothers, they went into wilderness not because they disliked people or cities, but because they sought a clearer, more transforming experience of Christ. And yet there was a method involved, and so there was a throwback to Jacob's ladder, and they saw a ladder of divine ascent emerging out of the wilderness. That the different steps would be like virtues, but they were ways in which wilderness could open up through prayer and the disciplines that they followed. And they saw it like an icon, because you look through the wilderness to the sources behind it. There's a whole system of knowledge that emerges out of wilderness. But with the rise of science and technology, we left all that in the past, and so that's something that still remains to be recovered. But we know that Luther was talking about it, so was Calvin. And both had a high valuation. So what happens after their time in the Enlightenment becomes a redirection of society into a materiality, and that's how we lost it, because the churches began to feel like their creation legacy didn't stand up against the science and technology that was fast emerging. And yet it was preserved by the inspired poets. So that you can see in Shakespeare, who says one impulse from a vernal wood can teach you more of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. And so what are those impulses from vernal woods? And we see in Longfellow, we feel, you know, the person who really recovers the wilderness legacy of the West is a surprise to people, because it's George Washington Carver. And it's because he was denied formal education. I mean, he tries to go to college, and he shows up in Kansas, and they say, oh, there's been a big mistake. You didn't tell us. And so he develops the concept of keys. And you can find this in the only book that was written about him while he was alive by a Presbyterian minister named Galen Clark. And it was written in 1938, and it's titled, The Man Who Talks with the Flowers. And he begins to lay out just a beginning entry into wilderness and to nature and what you gain from it. And he is so enthusiastic, he's bubbling over, and he was more eloquent than they expected, because finally, because of his studies on peanuts. Why peanuts? He studied peanuts because they would fix nitrogen in the depleted soils of the South that were exhausted because of tobacco and corn and cotton. And so he said, what will heal the soul is that which will refix nitrogen. And so he begins to promote peanuts, for which there was hardly any value except feeding pigs. And out of that, he gets not just peanut butter, but glues and paints and all these different things in this field called chemurgy, which we don't teach anymore, but it's a mixture of chemistry and biology and practical uses. And so he's finally invited to Congress, except there was a problem. He was black in an area of segregation. And so they said, we're going to give you 10 minutes to talk about this, because they knew that both Thomas Edison and Henry Ford had invited him to work. That was, at that time, the exorbitant salary of $100,000 a year. This is 1916. And so he's allowed to come to speak about some aspect to Congress. And an hour later, he's still waxing strong, as they said, well, let's let this go on a little more, and let's let this go on a little bit more. And he enchanted the Congress with these insights from agriculture and the ways to raise people. And it's a fascinating story about George Washington Carver developing the concept of keys, which were his own concept of virtues. He wanted to get windows that he could open up into wilderness so that you could have a more profound experience. And so he begins to redefine certain terms, and he's actually recovering some of the ancient Greek and Arabic understandings. And so he says, first you have to love it, because if you love anything enough, pretty soon it's going to talk to you. And then he says, there's a certain kind of expectancy. You have to assume that it's going to work. And then he begins to add in some unique qualities that he has a hard time defining. He goes on for a couple of paragraphs to address this quality. And what he was doing was recovering the much earlier Christian desert tradition, where they went out to encounter in the great cathedral of the Creator the lessons, but particularly the experiences out in nature that would transform, on the premise that the experiences are more potent teachers than the premises. Does that make sense to you? That the experiences teach you more profoundly than the premises. And so this is part of our lost Christian wilderness tradition. And that's still to be developed.
Let's give a round of applause. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, and trying to be around all day. Just a brief, this afternoon we have Ben Long from Resource Media, who is going to be, he's based out of Kalispell. They do a lot of work researching and thinking about how communication happens around important issues and difficult issues, especially in Montana. And so we're going to specifically focus on the issue of environmentalism and conservation and climate change, and what might be the messaging and the kinds of communication that are going to allow people to hear and to listen and to talk. And how do we do that? How do we go about that business? And so that'll be the afternoon session starting at about 1 o'clock. And then afterwards, if we're still awake and ready to go, we're gonna take about an hour, and we'll break into some groups and then do some work together about what that might look like for us. How would we consider messaging or being advocates or agents of change, maybe statewide, but maybe in our own circles, maybe, however we might want to think about that. And so we'll spend some time trying to unpack that and listen to each other. And then we have a fabulous dinner planned that we hope you stick around for, with a lot of local foods that have been donated from all around the area. We do have lunch now, and so you're invited to come and join us for lunch, and then we'll start up at about 1 o'clock. Was there any other pieces? Do I have all that? And Father Rob was just going to offer a blessing for our lunch.
Go, stand for a moment. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, who is everywhere present and who fills all things, the treasury of blessings and the giver of life, we invite you to make a home in our life, to help us remember and restore, recover our place in God's creation, to help us transform and heal our lives and our communities and our planet and God's creation. We thank you for the learning that we've been able to participate in this morning. We ask that you bless the remainder of our time that we have today, and we ask that you bless the food and drink of we, the servants of God, the hands that have prepared it, and all of us who will partake of it. For you are holy, now and forever, and to the ages of ages. Amen.
Amen.